Do you believe in blood over everything, or not anymore?
When your own parents look you in the eye and say they just cannot afford your treatment right now, you try to be reasonable. You tell yourself that maybe they are strapped and maybe this is a bad month. And you remind yourself that you are an adult who should be able to figure things out without turning your health into a family referendum. So you take a breath, you nod, and you say you understand, even though you do not. The specialist had been clear that I needed to move, not panic, just move, schedule the procedure, keep the pain from getting worse, and I walked out of that appointment with a printout, a number to call, and a plan that depended on my parents doing what they had always promised they would do if I ever faced something serious. They sat at the kitchen table, my mom with her hands folded like she was breaking bad news to a neighbor, my dad with his practical voice, and they said the words evenly, as if that made them more honest. We just cannot afford it right now. Honey, it is a lot. Things are tight. Let us catch our breath. I did the math in my head the way you do when you do not want to look desperate. I offered to split it, to set up a payment plan, to borrow and pay them back with interest if that made them feel better. I even said I would take the cheaper option if the specialist thought it was safe, and my mother touched my arm and said I should not make it about money because health comes first, just not right now, not this month. I went home and told myself I would handle it, I would lean on my savings and the credit line I had been avoiding, and I would stop expecting them to be different. 2 weeks later, my brother posted a video from an airport lounge with a flute of something bubbly and a caption about Europe calling, and he swung the camera to show the first-class seat like it was a personal victory. And my stomach clenched so hard I had to sit down. I stared at the screen for a full minute. Then I scrolled because maybe this was a work thing, maybe a client paid for it, maybe it was miles, maybe I was inventing a betrayal because I was scared. The next slide was my parents at the gate waving, my dad holding up the boarding pass like a game ticket, my mom writing that they were so proud of him for grabbing opportunities while he was young because chances like this do not wait. I called, and my mother answered like nothing was off, and when I asked how they could not afford my treatment but could send Ethan to Europe first class, she took a soft breath and said this was different because it was an investment in his future. And my dad chimed in from the background that I was being unfair to compare healthcare and career moves because life is complicated and parents make tough calls. I reminded them that my health was not a hobby and that my procedure had a timeline attached to it, and my mother said I was making it sound dramatic when it was actually just inconvenient. And then she added that I had always been strong and that she knew I would figure it out because I was the practical one. The word practical, tossed like a compliment and meant as a leash, hit me harder than the price tag. I did not yell, and I did not beg, and I did not perform pain for them. I opened my laptop while we were still on the call and pulled up the patient portal, and I asked the billing office for the cash price, the payment plan, the earliest slot, and the name of a case manager who would talk straight. While the hold music played, my mother asked me to promise I would not make a big deal of this to the family because people gossip and it would only bring stress, and I said nothing because I had learned that silence makes people say the truth out loud. The case manager came back with a number I could survive if I picked up 2 extra projects and cut a few things I would not miss, and I wrote it down and booked the slot for the soonest date that would not risk my job. That night I thought about the years of small favors that were never called favors, the way my brother's broken lease became a family emergency while my rent increase was a lesson in resilience. The way his car insurance quietly attached itself to my parents' account while my emergency fund was praised as proof I did not need help. The way they admired my independence as long as it freed them to keep funding his experiments. I did not want to be cruel, and I did not want to be petty, but I did want consequences, and I wanted them to feel the weight of their choice without me giving a speech they could pick apart. So I opened my medical file and changed my emergency contact from my mother to my friend Lexi, who shows up without asking for a script. And I removed my parents' access to my patient updates because they had not earned a front row seat to my recovery, while treating the ticket price like a bigger priority than my pain. In the morning, my phone lit up with messages about brunch photos from the airport and a reminder to like and share, and I watched the bubbles pop and vanish while I drank coffee and read the list of pre-op instructions. And I let the space between us open without ceremony. I recorded a new voicemail that said I was unavailable and to text if it was urgent, and then I set a filter that sent any call from my parents directly to voicemail, because if honesty was going to live here, it would start with the tone I allowed into my day. When my mother finally realized I was not picking up and wrote that she hoped I was not punishing them for doing their best, I typed a reply 3 times and deleted it 3 times. Then I did something small that would sound petty to anyone who has not been dismissed by people who claim to love you, and it still felt like justice. I drove to the clinic and signed the consent that named Lexi as the person who could make decisions if I could not. And as my pen lifted, my phone buzzed again with my mother's name flashing, and I turned it face down and let it ring, because this was the first step, and I was not going to break it for noise. I went to sleep the night after booking the procedure with the kind of angry calm you get when you stop arguing with a locked door and start looking for another way in. And by morning I knew the conversation I needed to have would not be one more plea for decency, but a short, clear statement that I would no longer participate in a game where my pain was framed as bad timing while their son's champagne counted as vision. I called my mother because I wanted to hear her voice when I said it, and I told her the facts without decoration, that I had a date, that I had a plan to pay, that Lexi would drive me and stay with me the first night, and that all updates would go through the case manager because I was removing them from my file. There was a pause, and then the voice she uses when she thinks a situation can still be smoothed over slid into the line. And she said she was glad I was being practical and that it would be better for everyone if I did not make this bigger than it needed to be. I asked her what bigger meant, and she said people talk, and I said people also read, and currently the internet was very readable about where the family money had gone this month. And she sighed the way she sighs when the dog chews a cushion and asked me not to take my feelings out on Ethan, because this trip was an opportunity he could not miss. My father took the phone and tried a different angle, the managerial tone, explaining that this was about timing and not value, that support looks different for different children, that he had always believed in my ability to land on my feet. Which sounded generous until you realize it was a polite way of saying we spend where the returns are flashier. I told him I had no intention of punishing anyone, that I was simply adjusting access to match reality, and that starting today I would be unreachable about anything that did not directly concern my recovery or my job. He said that sounded punitive. I said it sounded like boundaries, and he said those words did not belong in families, and I reminded him that the words first class apparently did. When he tried to pivot into how proud they were of both of us and how feelings were running hot, I ended the call before he could turn my pain into a team-building exercise. Then I did the things that make silence an actual plan rather than a mood, and I started with paperwork, because paperwork has teeth. I met Lexi at a notary and signed a medical power of attorney and a living will. And I sent the documents to the clinic with a request that they be uploaded to every relevant screen, so there would be no confusion in the moment when confusion can cost more than money. And I set alerts so every message and lab would ping both me and Lexi in real time. I went through my phone and moved my parents into a folder that routes straight to voicemail, and I changed the lock screen on my laptop to remove a family photo that had been there out of habit rather than comfort. And I logged into my insurance portal to verify that I was not inadvertently granting them access through some old form I had filled out when I was 20 and trying to be agreeable. I wrote a short email to my manager explaining that I would be out on a specific day, that I had coverage lined up, and that I was fine to handle light work from home after a brief window, and I kept the tone neutral because I did not want sympathy, I wanted clarity, and clarity is its own kindness when your body is already working hard. The texts began almost immediately, first my mother telling me I was scaring her by shutting down, then my father asking for the date so they could arrange to sit in the lobby like supportive parents. And then a string from Ethan with a photo of a cathedral and a caption about being sorry for the misunderstanding and a note that I should not let jealousy eat me because it would ruin my energy during recovery. I did not respond, because I had promised myself that I would not explain math to people who had already chosen the answer they liked. Instead, I sent one message and made it as unambiguous as a closed door, a single paragraph to my parents that said my healthcare decisions and updates would be handled by me and by the person I had legally designated. that there was nothing for them to do, and that if they needed to reach me about a true emergency that did not involve reputation or optics, they could email, and I would answer when I was able. I did not include the date, and I did not include the time, and I did not include any space for negotiation, and then I put my phone in a drawer and went for a walk around the block because my hands were shaking and I needed to remind my legs that they still belonged to me. When I returned, the drawer was buzzing like a trapped insect, and I let it. And I opened my laptop instead and pulled up a shared album that the extended family uses for birthdays and graduations and charity events, and every photo that proves we are all still marching in the same parade. And I added exactly 3 images with no caption. The first, a screenshot of my patient portal showing the name of the case manager with all the private details blurred. The second, a cropped slice of my brother's seat with the airline logo obvious and the glass raised mid-toast, and the third, a neutral quote from the specialist's public page about early intervention saving both money and pain, and then I closed the album and went back to my work. It was not a speech, it was not an accusation, and it was not a secret either. It was a nudge that would make its way through cousins and aunts without me lifting another finger, and when my mother called 5 minutes later and left a message that said I had just created drama that would hurt everyone, I sat very still and listened to her ask me to take it down for the sake of the family, and then I deleted the message and left the photos where they were. Because I had finally learned that silence is not the absence of sound, it is the refusal to perform for people who only clap when the soundtrack flatters them, and if that felt like revenge. It was the kind that comes wrapped in paperwork and illuminated by the truth they were so sure I would keep hiding for them. The album posts did exactly what I knew they would do without me adding a single word, because cousins who never comment on anything started dropping vague hearts and questions. Aunts who treat the family thread like a committee meeting began asking if I was all right in that tone that sounds kind until you realize it also carries a quiet accusation. And my mother started pushing a new narrative about misunderstandings and timing that could have worked if there had not been a clear picture of a glass raised above a branded seat and a caption about seizing the moment. So by the time I woke up the next day, the machine they had built around looking perfect was hiccuping loudly, and I had not lifted anything heavier than my phone to set a filter. The clinic called with pre-op reminders, and the case manager asked if there were any changes to emergency contacts, and when I said there were none, and that my attorney had already sent the updated forms, she said that made her job easier, which was the most uncomplicated sentence I had heard in weeks. And I told her I wanted to add one more line to the visitor instructions stating that only listed names should be allowed to enter, and that anyone else should be told the patient was resting and not available. And there was a pause that felt like respect before she said she would add it, and noted in bold on the chart. Ethan posted a story from a market with a caption about living your best life that would have made me roll my eyes on a normal day, and my father left a message saying they would like to come by that evening to drop off soup, which told me that the album had done what speeches never could and that reputation management had moved to the front burner, and still I did not answer because I had promised myself that the only people with access during this were the ones who had earned it. I texted Lexi a list of things I would need the day after the procedure, nothing dramatic, just groceries and a charger and her tendency to tell me to sit down when I start pretending I am fine. And then I opened my laptop and sent one more set of instructions, this time to the building desk, letting them know that I was expecting surgery and would have a friend staying for a few nights, that I would not be accepting visitors without approval, and that if my parents arrived unannounced they were not to be sent upstairs, which felt both ridiculous and necessary in the same breath because I knew exactly how they think, that showing up without warning puts you on the back foot and forces you into politeness. And I was not going to let etiquette be used as a lever against my health again. By late afternoon, the calls had shifted from guilt to warmth, my mother leaving long messages about making things right, about families bumping into difficult seasons, about how she had always admired my strength, which might have worked when I was 19 and still believed that being praised for resilience was a compliment rather than an excuse to keep all the soft places in me underfunded. And I let each one roll past because there was nothing in them that acknowledged the choice they had made. An aunt reached out privately to ask if the album meant what she thought it meant, and I told her I appreciated her concern and that I was fine and supported, which was true because support is not a dollar amount, it is a pattern. And mine was coming from people who did not need points for showing up, and when she hinted that my mother was hurting, I said that pain often follows accountability and left it there, because I have learned that the person willing to be uncomfortable first usually wins the long game. On the morning before the procedure, I picked up my paperwork from the notary and slid it into a folder that would go with me to the clinic even though copies were already uploaded, because I know how chaos works and I was not leaving anything to chance. And then I spent a quiet hour making a simple schedule for the next week that included rest, light work tasks that would keep my mind from spiraling, and blocks of time where I would not look at my phone at all, which may sound like a small thing, but when your family uses access as a currency, taking back your attention is the kind of wealth that feels like oxygen. The door buzzer sounded mid-morning and the front desk called to say my parents were in the lobby with a bag and smiles and a story about surprising me before the big day, and the calm that moved through me was not rage, it was relief. Because the plan was in place and I did not need to debate ethics in a hallway, I needed to protect my body and my time, so I asked the desk to follow the note on the file, to let them know I was resting and not receiving visitors, and to wish them a good day. The messages that followed were a mix of shock and demand, my father asking if I had really blocked them from seeing their own daughter, my mother writing that the desk had been mistaken and that she would like to come up for only a minute, just to hug me and leave the soup. And I typed out a long explanation and then deleted it because nothing I wrote would compete with the story she was writing for herself, and instead I sent a single sentence to the building desk thanking them for their help and confirming that the visitor policy would remain in place until further notice. Then I turned my phone face down and finished packing a small overnight bag because the clinic had recommended it, and I sat on the edge of my bed and breathed until the shakes went away. That evening, just as the sun was going down behind the buildings and the city got that low hum that makes you feel both small and very alive, a new voicemail landed from my father saying that they were coming back in the morning to try again because they could not be shut out like this, and I listened until the end. Then I opened the clinic portal and added one more instruction, a firm note that my parents were not permitted as visitors under any circumstances. And I hit save with a steadiness that surprised me, because in that moment I understood that I was not punishing anyone, I was protecting the space where I would heal, and I was about to find out how people behave when they are told no by someone they thought would always fold. The morning of the procedure arrived with the quiet knowledge that whatever happened inside the clinic was only half of the fight, because the other half was happening in hallways, inboxes, and living rooms where my parents were already weaving stories to make themselves look misunderstood instead of exposed. And I decided I would not waste a second defending myself to people who had already chosen which version of events was more convenient to believe. Lexi picked me up with coffee in the cup holder and that steady silence she carries that tells me I do not need to explain why my shoulders are tight, and at the clinic the staff moved with a precision that left no space for parental dramatics. Because the forms had been signed, the notes were in the system, and the bold red instructions on the visitor list left no room for interpretation. I came out of anesthesia groggy but clear enough to see Lexi's face at my side and a nurse checking vitals, and the only messages waiting on my phone when I woke fully were a string from my mother asking if I was alive because she had been told nothing, followed by another one 10 minutes later accusing me of deliberately humiliating them in front of the extended family by making my surgery into gossip fodder. I let the phone rest face down because nothing in those words had anything to do with me actually healing, and instead I focused on the practical markers of progress, the nurse explaining what soreness was normal, Lexi making sure the prescription bag came home with us, and the desk downstairs calling to say that visitors had tried to come up, but were turned away per instructions, which I confirmed with a thank you, because rules mean nothing unless you reinforce them. At home I shuffled between the couch and the bed, slow but steady, and while I sipped water I noticed that the family album had lit up again, this time not with photos, but with vague posts from my mother about the pain of being shut out by your own children, and comments from relatives saying they hoped everything would work out soon. I resisted the urge to type back because silence is harder work than shouting, but it is also sharper, and I had no intention of playing their script. By the third day, word had clearly spread beyond the album because a cousin called me privately, whispering like she was doing something wrong, saying she had heard I was recovering, but that my parents had told everyone I had forbidden them from even knowing the details, and she wanted to hear my side. I thanked her for asking but told her the truth was simple, that I had taken care of what needed to be taken care of, that I was supported, and that the details were not owed to anyone outside the circle I chose. And she paused before saying she respected that, but that my mother looked devastated, which made me smile without joy because devastation looks very different when it is rooted in losing control rather than losing a child. I hung up and felt lighter because I realized I did not need to explain more than that. I only needed to live in a way that made the story they were spinning collapse under its own weight. The first real crack showed at the family dinner 2 weeks later, one of those birthday gatherings where everyone takes pictures for the album and where my absence had been noted with too many exclamation points. I did not attend, but I knew enough from messages that filtered through cousins that the whispers had finally tilted, because someone asked my parents directly why they had money for a luxury trip but not for my medical care. And apparently my father's answer was that circumstances had been complicated, which only made the table quieter, because even people who usually side with him could see that complicated was a flimsy word to cover up priorities laid bare. My brother tried to smooth it over with jokes about me being dramatic, but an aunt apparently asked if it was dramatic to need surgery, and if that was the word we wanted to use for health, then maybe drama deserved a little more respect. While all this was happening, I sat in my apartment watching an old sitcom rerun and eating soup Lexi had left, and for the first time in months I felt the weight shift from my chest to theirs, because I had not said a word yet the narrative was bending anyway. And every time I refused to pick up the phone or post a rebuttal, their grip slipped a little more. That night my mother sent a long email about forgiveness, about families needing to stick together, about how one day I would understand the sacrifices they had made, and I read it slowly, recognizing every manipulative turn of phrase. And then I closed it without replying, because answering would have given the words life, and silence left them hanging in a void where only they had to hear the echo. By the end of that week, 3 different relatives had reached out to me with small fragments of the story, each one carrying less certainty than the last, and I knew the cracks were widening, because my parents had built their reputation on being the reliable ones, the supportive ones, the ones who could be counted on, and once that story began to falter, every past decision they had made was going to look different under the new light. I did not need to push, I only needed to wait, because silence is slow, but it is merciless, and I was watching it spread like a fracture across the perfect family picture they had been polishing for years. Recovery gave me a kind of brutal clarity that I had not expected, because when your body forces you to move slowly, you can finally see which parts of your life sprinted only because you were always the one pushing. And once I saw that clearly, I stopped wondering how to make my parents understand and started deciding what they would have to do if they wanted access to me at all. Which sounds cold until you remember that they had already set the exchange rate when they turned my health into a budgeting inconvenience while buying my brother a glass of champagne in a reclining seat. I waited until I could stand without the room dipping, then I wrote 1 letter on paper and 1 message to the album, and I kept both calm, short by my standards, and impossible to misread. Because ambiguity is the currency of people who want forgiveness without the invoice, and I was done operating a tab they never planned to settle. The letter went directly to my parents, and it laid out the only path back that I would recognize as good faith, and I used ordinary words rather than therapy jargon, because I did not want them to argue about vocabulary while dodging the point. And the point was simple enough to survive any audience, that they had chosen to fund a luxury trip instead of my surgery, that the choice had not been made under duress or confusion, because it had been documented in smiling photos and proud captions, and that repairing this would require concrete action rather than sentimental speeches. I asked for 3 things that even they could understand. First, a written acknowledgement of what they did without the words misunderstanding, timing, or complicated. Second, a transfer of the full amount of my treatment not to me but to the hospital's patient assistance fund under a reference code I included. and third, a commitment that any future financial help for either child would be matched dollar for dollar to the other or publicly disclosed to the family so that no one would be forced to guess where they stood again. I told them that once all three existed, we could sit with a mediator and talk, and until then my phone would remain a wall rather than a door, and I wished them health and ended with my signature, not because the sentiment was warm, but because the boundary was. The album message was even simpler, and it did not mention them by name, which was the sharpest part of it, because I have learned that silence paired with an unmistakable implication does more damage to a curated image than any shout. And the message said only that I was recovering well thanks to my friend, my employer, and the excellent staff who treated me with urgency and respect, that I would not be answering questions about timing or logistics, and that anyone moved to help could donate to the hospital's patient assistance fund with the same reference code, because plenty of patients do not have the privilege of a steady job or a friend who shows up with soup and a charger, after which I added the code, hit post, and closed the app. Within an hour, cousins began liking it and two sent me screenshots of their small donations, which I thanked privately, and by evening an aunt had shared the link more widely with a note about doing something useful rather than arguing on threads, which told me everything I needed to know about how the wind had shifted inside the family rooms where I had been painted as ungrateful for a week straight. My parents did not respond to the letter right away, but my mother tried to call and then sent a message that said the terms felt punitive and that love should not be measured in receipts. And I read it twice and then filed it with the other messages that tried to sell me feelings at a discount, because it took effort to pretend that the only reason I could possibly be drawing a hard line was spite rather than survival. And I was no longer offering them the grace of pretending that confusion lived where entitlement sat. 2 days later, my father wrote an email asking whether the fund would accept an anonymous donation and whether I would consider that sufficient in lieu of a written acknowledgement, and I said that anonymity was fine for the fund, but not for the harm, and that a single paragraph containing the truth was the bare minimum for any adult relationship, and I sent 3 sample sentences in plain language so he could not claim he did not know what I meant. A week passed without movement, and then the hospital portal displayed a zero balance with a note that a third-party donation had been applied to the assistance fund with my reference code, and the amount far exceeded what I had paid, covering other patients as well, which made me sit down on the edge of my bed and laugh in a way that was not joyful but was deeply relieving, because I suddenly understood that it did not matter whether it came from them or from an aunt who had decided to short-circuit their pride, since the point of the plan had never been to extract money from my parents. It had been to replace the old economy between us with one I could live inside without losing pieces of myself. An hour later, an email landed from my father containing 4 sentences that named the choice and did not use the words timing or complicated or misunderstanding, and while it dodged any deep apology, it did not lie, which was new, and I replied with a single line confirming receipt and repeating that we could schedule a session with a mediator when I was ready. My mother texted that she missed her daughter and that she hoped this was not forever, and I looked at my phone and let the screen fade to black, because forever is not a punishment when it is simply the length of time you are willing to live with your own peace protected. And then I updated my voicemail to the final version, the one that thanked callers for their care and explained that I do not return calls about optics, reputation, or family pressure, that any attempt at reconciliation would go through the address I had set up for that purpose with the subject line reconciliation, and that emergencies unrelated to those topics would be answered when I was able, after which I placed the phone on the table like an object that finally belonged to me. They still try, and the album still hums, and there will always be someone who thinks that silence is cruelty because they have never been forced to survive on it. Yet the only voice that matters now is the one that speaks when I look in the mirror and understand that the plan was never to break them, it was to stop letting them break me. And that the last move was not the fund or the letter, or the messages, but the simple decision to build a life where my health, my attention, and my forgiveness are not cheaper than a seat on a flight, and if you want to know whether I pick up when they call, the answer is that I do not because I am angry, but because I finally won the only game that ever mattered, the one where I decide what the terms are, and I keep them.